There was a guy you mentioned in your series, Sabbatai Zevi. I think he's the Jewish mystic,
Yeah.
and he had a branch of Jew. He came. I think he started a branch of Judaism or of the Kabbalah. He got some of the Kabbalah, and it was all about transgression, about how to transgress. You had to do a certain amount of transgressions in order to instigate the Messiah that God will come. He was trying to act out some of the prophecies, I think. Do
Yeah, his name is pronounced in various ways. So you look at it Sabbatai Zevi sometimes, or Sabbatai Zvi. I'll call him Sabbatai Zvi because it's shorter, it's easier to say. So Sabbatai Zvi, yeah, he was a fellow who in the 1600s, in what's now the Ottoman Empire, the Balkans, the Near East, proclaimed himself the Messiah. And he believed that as the Messiah, one of the things that since he had showed up, that the old laws, that all of the Jewish laws, and there are lots of them, 600 of them, okay, and change. All of these, this is all of these very things. You have to do this, and you have to do it in a certain way, and you can eat this, and you can't eat that, and you can't eat these things together. And if you mess up, you have to bury the plate in the back. Okay, this is just rules and rules and rules and rules and rules. And that's one of those things that provides a kind of structure to life. That's a good example. It does. It does. You get up every morning and you know that there's certain things you can do and you can't do, and you have to do them in a particular order. And so, while it gives a structure to your life, the other part of it is that it's also tiresome and oppressive because you have to do these things all the time without, and things that often just seem to be arbitrary. Okay. And, why are you doing this? Because God says that you must. God never explains himself. Okay. It's not going to explain why you have to have, snaps instead of buttons. No, no, that's just it. That's the way these things are decreed. So, it's one of those things you can either kind of take comfort in and you can feel that it maps out your life for you, or it's one of those things that can be horribly, just tiresome and restrictive. And most of those currents are always running in everybody at the same time. They're just things that, you know, uh, let's say, it's the Sabbath and you're not supposed to be able to manipulate anything. Is that, wouldn't life be simpler that you wouldn't have to go out and hire a non-Jew to come in and turn everything on and off for you? I mean, is God really going to be upset if you just flip on and off the lights? Well, you're not supposed to. So it depends upon how serious you do that. So the laws are either a kind of blessing, but they're also a kind of curse in a certain way. So Shabtai Zvi said was that, well, I'm the Messiah, I'm and it's a new dispensation. So once I've gotten here, all these old laws don't mean anything, and we need to usher in a kind of change. And one of the ways that you will do that, one of the things he would urge his followers to do, was not simply ignore the laws. That's something else. Not simply ignore them, but to deliberately and to intentionally violate them. And that they needed to do that as a way of, I think, in some ways, of breaking the kind of mental hold that those laws had over them. You have to break out of this because you've lived your whole life believing that there are all these things you can and you can't do. And now what you need to learn is that you can do them. There's nothing that stops you from doing it. And there's not going to be any kind of thunderbolt from heaven that's going to come down if you do them. So this is what you have to get into the practice of doing it. And in a way, it was getting his followers to engage in what essentially was a kind of almost reverse ritualistic activity, that is, undoing things, undoing the laws. Not, remember, not just ignoring the laws, but undoing them, reversing them as a way of negating everything that they had represented before.
does he still have followers? Do people still follow him?
Supposedly, yes. I'm not sure how much of an organized, I'm not sure whether there's an well, his followers were generally called Sabbataians after his name, Shabtai. And so he dies, I think he dies before the end of the 17th century. A lot of his followers, well, there's a whole, maybe there's a story about him, which is worth bringing in here. So he was very active in the Ottoman Empire, the Turkish Empire at the time, which was a Muslim empire. It had Jewish and many Christian subjects, but it was a Muslim empire, and Islam was in the lead position. So essentially, in the Ottoman Empire, whatever existed was what it was that the Sultan and Islamic law allowed to exist. So Christians and Jews were allowed to practice their religions. They had no right to do so. They were permitted to do so. And what it was that the Sultan heard that there was this, crazy Jew over here who was claiming to be the Messiah and getting his followers to do all kinds of things. And of course, you had other rabbis, Orthodox rabbis, who were going to the Sultan and going, "This guy's a heretic. Something has to be done to stop him. He's going to destroy our entire community." And if you were the Sultan, you might wonder, what's this guy's intention, right? Is he just some sort of religious nut? Or is he actually planning some kind of rebellion? What's the idea here? So he was summoned to the Sultan, and he was given a choice. And his choice is that well, you can continue with all of this Messiah talk, and if you do, we're going to cut your head off. You're going to be executed. Or right now, in front of everybody, you can embrace Islam, and then you'll be spared. So what did the Messiah, Sabbatai Zevi, do? He embraced Islam. Now, that, of course, came as a tremendous shock to a lot of people. And keep in mind, his reputation had spread not just within the sort of Balkans and the Near East, but Jews throughout Europe, in places like Germany and Holland, heard about this. And this was big news because there were many people, I don't think everybody, but there were a lot of them who believed that the Messiah has actually come and all kinds of wonderful, great, and groovy things are going to happen. And now you hear that, well, this guy was pulled up before the Sultan and, essentially kissed the Quran, and that appeared to be the end of it. But when questioned about this, Sabbatai Zevi had what to him was a perfectly logical explanation. He goes, look, all the laws of Judaism, as I've just told you, are meaningless. They are a meaningless ritual, which I, as the Messiah, have now said that you don't have to do, and I've told you to violate them. That is, all existing religions are all bunk. And therefore, Christianity and Islam are exactly the same. They're just more sort of useless rituals that you carry out. So the fact that I publicly converted to a Muslim means nothing because Islam means no more than the old laws of Judaism did. They're all meaningless and repeated. So you can be anything, but you can still believe in me as the Messiah, and you can still believe in the new rules that I'll have for you, and you can pretend to practice all the rest of this stuff, and it doesn't matter because it's all bunkum. So most people didn't buy that. They thought he just chickened out, which I think he probably had. But others did. So there were still followers who went along with him, and there were many of his followers, many of his Jewish followers, who followed him by publicly converting to Islam. And that group of people still exist in Turkey to this day, and they're generally identified with the Dunma. It's usually spelled D-O with an umlaut over it, N-M-E-H, Dunma, which are, those who simply have sort of converted. But they were Jews who followed Sabbatai Zevi, becoming Muslims, but without actually any intention of becoming Muslims. They would go through the motions, thus receive a certain degree of social protection and legitimacy, but then go on to practice their own ideas privately. And so the Dunma certainly exist. I think the argument you get today is that, oh, no, we're good Orthodox Sunni Muslims. We don't go any more of this kind of weird stuff. But then others will argue that they do. Who knows? But then there were other followers, more so in Central Europe, in areas like Hungary and Poland, among the Jewish communities there. And Sabbataianism survived, and in small groups. And then about a century later, there was another Jewish figure in Central Europe by the name of Jakob Frank. And Frank proclaimed himself several things. He also at some point proclaimed himself to be the reincarnation of Sabbatai Zevi and therefore the Messiah. And he began to kind of revive this movement around himself, mostly in Poland and in Germany. Never became quite as big of a deal. But for instance, one of the things that he did in Poland was that he convinced thousands of Jews to become Catholics, to all go to the local church and argue that they wanted to be, that they wanted to be baptized. And of course, no, Catholic Church was really, local. We're happy, perfectly happy to oblige. You want to be baptized? Just line up here. We'll go through the whole thing. Plus, probably some catechism that will come along with that. But then there were other Catholic officials who were very suspicious of this. They go, look, this just doesn't really happen. What's this whole guy's intention? And his intention basically was to get political protection, because he realized that if he and his followers were considered heretics by the larger Orthodox Jewish community. The other rabbi, of course, hated him. He's the worst thing imaginable. He's a Jewish apostate who's now arguing, who's now leading tens of thousands of Jews into the arms of the Christian church, and therefore attempting to, with the whole idea of actually destroying our entire community. Because Frank, like Sabbatai Zevi before, was saying that all the old laws of Judaism are meaningless and should be repudiated, and therefore all the authority of the rabbis are meaningless as well. You should no longer pay any attention to these people. So he was their worst enemy. And they wanted the Polish officials to stop him. They wanted him they said this man is a kind of rebel and a reprobate. And so his way of getting around that was in some ways to do exactly what Sabbatai Zevi had done, was to simply embrace the existing non-Jewish political and religious order as a means of gaining protection, but without any actual idea of becoming legitimately Christians or practicing Catholicism. It was purely a cover for something else. And so there was a lot of criticism even among the Catholic clergy in Poland, because they didn't trust what he was doing. They didn't trust his intention, for good reason. But he would later end up in Germany. He would find various Christian German noblemen who would support him. There were always people who would go along with this. He died, and when he died, the successor to his movement was his daughter, Eva, or Eve. And I don't think she lived that much longer after him. But this was even stranger, because, one of the things you would not find within traditional Orthodox Judaism was any woman in a position of religious leadership. That just wasn't going to happen. Okay, this was a different time and a different place, but there were no female rabbis. And also, there was no woman who was to be accorded almost sort of goddess-like status. And in her case, this actually included to people who were loyal to the Sabbatean, or what was now called Frankism, was that they would actually keep little idols of her. And so one of the things that became a kind of identification among people who held to this Frankist Sabbatean belief, by the time we get to the 1800s, where they're still around, is that they would have these little images, these little idols of Eva. And that was, and you would sort of keep those someplace in the home. Otherwise, it would look like a perfectly normal Jewish Orthodox home, because you were supposed to blend in. But behind the scenes, you would have your little idol of Rosa Frank's daughter, which I don't know. I guess you'd do something which you would venerate in some form or another. And then you would do things at home, like go through and systematically violate as many Jewish laws as you could, because the whole idea is that you were going to undermine this whole, and your enemy was the traditional Jewish faith. And so part of your job, part of your profession of your Frankist faith, was to do everything you could, more or less secretly, to undermine and discredit traditional Judaism.
Do you think there's any truth in the, well, I don't want to say a rumor, but just that the idea that some of the Jewish elites were Frankists, especially in Germany?
Well, that's that's where it sort of came. That's where you sort of see its last kind of manifestation. Certainly, there were followers of Frank around well into the 1800s, and that even continues into the. I've even found references to them in the early 20th century. So I don't know why there wouldn't be any which would be around today. There were certain towns. I can't remember what it was. There were towns in Bohemia, for instance, in what was then within Central Europe, that the Habsburg Empire, that were known as being particular strongholds of Frankism. But it was all quite secret by that time because it was one of those things, that if the traditional rabbinate found about this, they would go after it. I mean, they were something that they were constantly trying to. It was, well, the simplest way to describe it, it was Jewish heresy, and therefore the rabbinate, the rabbinic, the Jewish religious establishment would look upon this in the same way that the Catholic Church would have looked upon something like Catharism in the Middle Ages. This was something to be found and extirpated, to be gotten. It was considered to be a dangerous threat to the faith. So it was never tolerated where it was found. There were a lot of people who would accuse other people of being Frankists. And maybe in some cases that was true. It was something else that you could throw at someone, which would be difficult for them to disprove. But if you could tar them with that label, that might be effect. So it became one of those things that people would accuse each other of. There was certainly some practice of it, and I'm sure that it is still practiced to some degree today. I don't think there's any well, I don't know. You don't see any particular large example of it, nor do I think that wouldn't be the same kind of reason today to hide as much as possible. I mean, think of it this way. What is it? There must be some sort of EU regulations that would argue that Frankists would be as free to practice that. Okay. They wouldn't have to, I don't think they would have to be afraid as much as they did previously.
Hmm.
So it's probably, sort of degenerated to the level of a hereditary cult in some cases. Probably not a terribly dangerous element. There is an interesting book if someone wants to look at this, and I'm not endorsing I'm just saying the book exists and it has a point of view. And it is a book called To Eliminate the Opiate, and it is by an Orthodox rabbi by the name of Rabbi Antelman. I think it's Antelman. I think he lives in Israel. And his whole argument is that, every bad corrupting influence in Judaism for the last 400 years has been Sabbataianism, and that this is always part of this. And part of his idea, an interesting one, is that as part of their pernicious war against Judaism, that the Frankists actually will actively stimulate anti-Semitism, which is one of those words that, of course, simply means one thing: anti-Jewism, which oddly we never like to say, but that's what you're talking about, and that's what they'll do. So it's a very provocative argument, and that's one of the things that would eventually lead Frankists, if you believe that your goal was to destroy the old Jewish religion as it was, to make way for the new one, that you had to discredit it, then certainly anything which would draw hostility and negativity towards that would be something that you would, as a Frankist, support. So Antelman's view, maybe to oversimplify it, is that Frankists became a driving force in anti-Semitism within Europe. That wherever you would find Jew baiters, you would find Frankists among them, sort of egging them on, and even more provocatively, that they would do things in order to, as a sort of role of Jews, that they would do things pretending to be Orthodox Jews to draw animosity towards the whole larger community. In other words, that they were very, very subversive, dangerous people.
It sounds almost like Satanism.
Well, that's an interesting question. What does that? I think Anton would argue, yeah, that's about as close as you can probably get to Satanism within Judaism. Satanism often has this whole thing about, now that itself that's a term which can be applied to many different things. There's a whole episode. I don't know what you're saying, but one of the things I have an episode on is Satanism. Sort of, you have a kind of modern view of it, which isn't the same as the one that you would necessarily have elsewhere. And there's even that within that, there's the whole argument as to whether or not, do you believe in Satan as a kind of actual entity? That there is a being. Or, and this itself was a debate within Judaism as to whether Satan was an actual evil spirit or whether he simply was the personification of the inclination towards evil in all people. What we were talking about earlier, the idea of just malevolence, of just doing just being mean for the sake of being mean, and that there was an inclination, and that Satan then was a kind of a personification, a caricature which was created to represent that which was everywhere, or whether he was specifically a independent thought, willful evil spirit, or maybe both in those cases.